I am unashamed. What about you?
All right, welcome back to Unashamed. Still down here at the Southern Lair, tuning in to Jace and Phil at the lair. So, Jace, what you got going on? Y'all doing any hunting or what's happening?
We have been hunting. It's been a remarkable year. I'd say above average. We had this huge ice storm. Ice not it's falling from the sky, but it got down to, what was it, 10 degrees, I think?
12 or 14, something
yeah.
like that.
So everything froze. Then, the ducks they're going to move on that. But now we're, a week after the new year, I guess, and, it's 70 degrees and feel like you could be on a beach somewhere. Oh, you are, Al.
Oh, I am a beast somewhere.
Oh, yeah. So, but let me tell you this, because it's gonna tie in with what we're going to talk about. People are easily fooled, and we live in these fake realities. The last podcast we talked about why nobody wants to take serious the eternal life aspect of what Jesus offers is because we have to go through that process. And we'll continue that because Jesus is here. We're talking about an eternal being becoming human for us and have to go through the abandonment and the agony of death for us and being, separated from God. For us, he took our place and got what we deserve. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this that happened. You might have heard it through the grapevine. So we had our Christmas at our house, our Robertson family Christmas for ever since I was a kid. We always had it at y'all's house. But you had your back surgery, and plus there's just so many people now with everybody being fruitful and multiplying that we just needed a bigger house. And so after we had the festivities, and I don't know if we talked about that in an earlier podcast, what all we did. We ate good. We have a...
No, we didn't.
We have a Cajun Christmas as far as food, because we have shrimp. What we had? I fried shrimp. I fried 10 pounds of shrimp, and they were gone. I fried them in 15 minutes with my assistant, my son, Reed, and they were gone in less than 5.
We also had crawfish pies that Willie made, Mom's recipe. They were delicious. Dad made a crab meat au gratin that was fantastic. So
so
a lot of really good.
We had the crab meat au gratin. We had the crawfish pie. We had the shrimp, and we had another 5 pounds of boiled shrimp. And Jay actually, what was that he cooked?
He did a pork butt. He smoked a pork butt too. So
yeah,
which was
and
delicious.
It was fantastic. And we had all the desserts, and we didn't really do a gift exchange. Kay did her usual gag gift it's like a real funny moment, but nothing's funny. It's actually funny because they're not funny.
That's right.
So we do that every year. And I think she got me some kind of plaid, looked like a Hawaiian shirt, but has cards on it. I think it was an attempt to have some kind of like a poker shirt or something because I play poker.
What's interesting,
it wasn't funny.
While you're there, is I looked at all the family groups, the numbers, with you being the oldest, Al, Jace is second, then Willie. Then what's that fourth one's name?
Jep. Well, you have Phyllis in there.
We have Phyllis in between.
And you got Phyllis in there. But this was the only family group that multiplied this large amongst all the Robertsons. My oldest brother, just a couple of kids, and then there was a lot of people showing up because they weren't there. Harold, same way. Judy, same way. Jan, to a lesser degree, but there. But out of all those family groups, the largest one by far is the one that y'all are the head of.
Right. well, I hope Jep doesn't listen to this podcast, but but part of that is, your before Jesus activities, which led to eventually Phyllis, and their family, and they have 2 sons, and then their families, and then we've all adopted or fostered
That's right.
kids, and so you have all their families have grown. I mean, you're right. It looks like
It is like 50 or 60, maybe.
Yeah, it looks like the United Nations, which I don't think is a bad thing because I think that's a result of being in Jesus. But it's quite the number is big. I mean, look, it was after we got finished.
10 pounds of shrimp in 5 minutes. That just gives you a little.
I mean, look, that our house literally looked like a bomb had gone off after everybody was out. I mean, there were, somebody had a dog that peed on a lot of Missy's curtains, and she she was not happy. But I had to remind her that houses are there to be used and abused, and this is part of it. And so that was the only thing she was really upset about. It was just some dog. She had these white curtains because it was cold on our it was actually 20, 25 degrees, but we had so many people that she wanted to use the back porch. So she come out with a great idea. She put curtains on the outside porch and had a fire. We have a fireplace on our back porch, and it was actually nicer out there than it was inside because there was so many people.
Oh, that's
inside.
where I hung out because it wasn't
awesome.
super cold, but inside was so hot because there were so many people. So I love the back porch of it. I thought
you
she
saw
did
the
great.
white flowing curtains out. Well, somebody's dog that they brought peed strategically on every one. It was like, how could one dog have that much pee in their body to mark all the white curtains?
He was happily marking his territory.
So I'm bringing this up because I want to tell you a story that happened. So when it got down, they like 15 to 20 of the younger crew of our family were organizing a capture the flag that happened after the meal. John Luke Willie's son was coordinating that. But I noticed most of the people involved in that were under 30 years of age, which I wasn't sure what capture the flag is, but it's basically them running through the neighborhood, 2 teams trying to win. So Reed said his team won. So that's all I know about that. But right before they were having their little meeting and setting the rules off, well, somebody said, "Where's that cat?" Because you got to remember, we had the whole family there, and it was almost like an episode of the Christmas Vacation movie. Because you had some members of our family that brought some food that did not get eaten. Because in our family, there's a certain visual and a smell test that happens on all the food. 90% of it was fantastic. But there was some food brought that nobody touched, which I thought was fascinating.
The visual just didn't stack up or something.
Nope. And so we were...
That's from the ones whose... my granddaughters and whatnot, the lack of training on their part.
Yeah. It was so funny because it was like, it reminded me of that scene in Christmas Vacation where the old grandma, she wrapped up something in to bring as a meal, but it was moving inside the box.
Aunt Bethany.
Aunt Bethany.
Yeah.
So we had the curtains being peed on.
That's always a double take on that.
So we were assessing all this situation, and somebody said, and there were still probably 20 people there, but everybody there was young. And somebody said, "Where's this cat? Do y'all have a cat?" And Missy, her gag gift from Kay was a sweater. A Christmas sweater with a cat on it. Because you're like, why is that funny? Because Missy doesn't like cats at all. I mean, she's okay if you have them, but she doesn't. She's not a cat person. And so that just sets the tone for now. All of a sudden said, "Where's this cat?" And so I was like, there's a cat, and it sounded like it was trapped. Every so often you would hear just a cat. And we all started looking for this cat because it was sounding more and more distressed, and we could not find this. Look, I got the attic door down. We're looking, and somebody said, finally,
there's a cat trapped in the house.
It's trapped in the house. And look, emotion started running high. And some of Phyllis's daughter-in-law, she's getting, because she is a cat person, and so emotions start getting high because this cat sounds like it's in distress and pain. And about every time you would zero in on it, you would lose the cat was just every so often you would hear this sound. So we tore that place apart looking for this cat. In fact, Willie's adopted son, Rowdy, he was in a vent, like an air conditioner vent. He's like, that cat is in this air conditioner vent. I mean, I looked in there. It went from being destroyed to now we're into the infrastructure of that house. We're trying to go through walls.
Hunting the cat.
So finally, Brighton, which is Reed's wife, she comes out because she was putting their baby down. And she heard the sound. And she said, I think there's something going on in our society where people are buying tapes of distressed animals and using it as a prank. And we were all looking like dumbfounded, like, is this...
Surely a bunch of rednecks is not stooped this low.
She said, I think somebody's pranking you. So then everybody started looking in places you wouldn't normally look, would be like paintings on the walls and pictures. And sure enough, Reed, behind a picture that was actually our Christmas CD when it went platinum or whatever, somebody had stuck a little device that looked like a bug, but it was a tape recording of a cat every few seconds going. So I'm like,
what kind of mind was that? So who was the author of this?
That's where it went next. It then turned into a game of Clue.
Yeah.
Which is, in the music room, because that's where it was, who would have done this? So an investigation started. And so everybody was trying to figure out who would have done this, because, because Kay's known for pranks and all, but she doesn't have the technical sophistication
at all
to know this. And so we kind of thought it was Willie. That was who we kind of all agreed, because he's Mr. Prankster. And I just thought, I just can't see Willie doing that. But I basically thought it was. And then a voice, when there was a silence, when we had concluded it was Willie, a young teenage girl voice said, I did it. And we all looked, and she started laughing. So Jay and Anna, Al, have you heard this, that she did this?
I'm fully aware of the whole operation. I knew about it beforehand, but yeah.
So Al's daughter's daughter, who's 15, she did it. BK. And she started laughing and just laughed and laughed.
She unleashed bedlam.
If I would have had a video of Missy looking at her. Missy was
Oh, Jace, there is a video, because the whole time y'all were having the discussion, BK was videoing it, and she came home and showed us, and we laughed so hard. The look on Missy's face whenever it was all revealed, she has captured that on video.
So it really turned out to be the best prank ever, and the least likely person. Now, I don't know what that's a sign of.
She's a quiet little girl. You just wouldn't think.
Quiet. You just wouldn't think. And I thought, there's some devious tendencies there, because now that I've heard that she videoed it all, Al, you better keep an eye on her. So not only did she do it, she filmed all.
I wouldn't have thought of doing that.
Look, Phil, it was a 30-minute. Stop everything what you're doing, tear the place apart, and find this cat.
Oh, and she's laughing the whole time.
Videoing it.
We call her the silent assassin. So now you know why. Let's take a break. Yeah, well, I'll have to tell her you brought that. I didn't know you were going to talk about it, but we've laughed so hard about that.
I brought it up because I was just thinking from a spiritual context, people are vulnerable and they believe something to be true when it wasn't. We were all sincerely duped.
Hoodwinked.
And to bring this to a serious nature, you do not want to be duped when it comes to who created the universe, on who Jesus is and the consequences therein.
Yeah.
I mean, because look, it had the image and the feel that there was a cat in the house, but it wasn't there. It was a trick.
Prankster.
No, that's a great point, because when you look at this in the big picture, you're exactly right. The reason they call the devil the adversary, the accuser, that's what he does. He sows things that look like reality but really aren't. And that's exactly how sin got into the world. And that's how he's used that, along with the fear of death, to lead so many people astray, because he helps them create a false reality.
Yeah, that's why I brought up the emotions of this. I mean, look, because people thought this cat was in trouble and their emotions got involved, and it became like they were raising their voice. And I mean, this cat is dying.
Yeah.
We must find this cat. And meanwhile, the 15-year-old girl's over there chuckling. Over the whole process about the nature, you really saw the souls of individuals, especially those who really love cats.
Yeah.
And it was disturbing, because I was upset because I thought, if this cat dies in these walls, I'd already thought, reflected back to your infamous rat story.
Yep.
When rats die in between walls, now you brings up a whole host of other critters.
It sure does.
And the smell, which I have a high sense of smell, I was like, we got to get this cat out of here.
It's a redneck story.
That's what we would call fake news. That's exactly right. So I guess that's the perfect lead to get us back to Mark 14. In the last podcast and in the overtime, we talked about Jesus, the emotional depth that Jesus shows in this moment, because it is so powerful, what he's about to do to take away the sins of the world. And we get to verse chapter 14. So we talked about him in the garden praying. Yep. And he even tells Peter, he says, I prayed for you, don't fall into temptation. And I thought it was interesting. I don't think we mentioned it last time, Jase, but I think that was another direct thing to Peter. It was like, because he's already mentioned that Satan wanted to sift him like wheat. And so it's almost like he's prepping him like, your night's just beginning too. Because they've been all sleepy and, weepy, but now all of a sudden it's like the wake-up call when we get to 14:43.
Well, right. And so we had talked about 14:43 through 51, because then you had Judas, which was one of the 12 appeared, because Jesus had just said, "Rise, here comes my betrayer," because they were asleep at the post. And with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, and sent from the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders. And we talked about this. In one of the versions, Jesus says friend, calls Judas friend, which we didn't talk about that, because you would think at that moment, here's one of his followers betraying him. And one of the other gospels, he actually asked Judas confronted him. He said, "Are you going to betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Now look, he didn't ask him because he didn't know that.
That's right.
He asked him to put Judas on the spot. It's one thing to betray Jesus, it's another to be confronted by Jesus and force you to admit what you've done. So I still think it shows you that Jesus he's full of grace, but he confronts us with things that we don't want to address in our life. And that's why you have these two extremes on people's approach to Jesus. There's just no middle ground found here. You're either going to surrender to Jesus or you're not going to like him.
Jace, don't you think that's why Judas chose this intimate way of greeting someone? Like when you gave someone a kiss, and usually they kissed on both sides of the cheeks, it was an intimate way of saying we have a relationship. And I thought it was interesting because obviously Judas is now already set apart, because remember, he left, when Satan entered him, he left the Lord's Supper, angry and ready to betray him. So it's not like they're that close anymore. And yet he gives this false narrative now with this kiss of Jesus that, we're still close as I'm turning you over to this mob. So I don't think it's an accident that he chose such an intimate greeting to do what he did.
Yeah, it was the worst thing he could have done. And even there, Jesus showed his integrity by calling him friend, by confronting him. Because look, a lot of times when we confront people, it's not easy and it becomes awkward and it's uncomfortable, but we do it because we love people. We've all had interventions in our family and different people, and that people lose their way, and you say, what do? You're confronting with them because you love them. And so it's sad that Judas carried it out. And so the men seized Jesus in verse 40 and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword, and we talked about this, which we know was Peter. And Jesus said, am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. And then everyone deserted him and fled. Because you got to remember, this was the key moment now that all his disciples said, well, wait a minute. I thought, you can feed thousands of people out of thin air. You can heal people. You can raise people from the dead. You're the ultimate warrior. And he had given this little speech about bringing the swords. And so they all were under the impression, there's fixed to be a scrap. So when Jesus backs down, well, then they leave because their view of Jesus did not fit with who he really is. And so it's sad, but it's true. But it's also kind of sobering for us, because you got to remember, to see the real Jesus, you got to read this for yourself. You can't come up with some kind of narrative in your mind that you think Jesus should be, and then follow him based on that.
This is a roughly speaking, at least 6,000 year event that was predicted through the prophets all the way up to Matthew, and the time is near.
All right.
They're preaching the kingdom of God, and then Jesus begins to tell them, we're going up there, I'm going to die. The chief priests, they're going to kill me.
Yeah, he had told them, but they just didn't like it. That's right. He just didn't, it wasn't, that's why they all left.
The warning had already been told to them repeatedly.
And then they throw in this.
Before you read that, I wanted to make a point about the mob. Before we do that, let's take a break. So I found it interesting that when it comes to political nature, the same things we see today, 2,000 years after this instance, it's common all the way through. So the chief priests, teachers of the law, the Pharisees, those who had drummed up this whole thing, because they're the ones behind the scene that have decided Jesus has to die because he's a threat to their power. But they don't go get him. What they do is they find a willing mob to go and get him. And so I think the irony is so thick here.
Hitman.
Yeah, exactly. And you see people do the same thing today. These people behind the scenes that won't have a political agenda, but they won't do it themselves. They whip up a mob and send the mob. It's like, look, the people have decided
and
that this has to be done.
They fix it so all the blame is on the hitmen, not them.
Exactly.
They're the fuel.
Exactly. So I find that interesting that even at this time, you see the same things in motion that you see to this very day.
Exactly.
That's what happens when it's a satanic plan.
Yeah. So the reason we're going back to this point, because when we talked about a couple of podcasts, Judas's betrayal and Peter disowning Jesus, we kind of skipped the prayer in Gethsemane, which we did last podcast, but we also skipped Jesus before the Sanhedrin which is his first trial, and the ramifications of this, look, are really the most important aspect of this whole interesting thing, because everybody leaves, but now you have the true judge being on trial. I mean, we've got this backwards here. We should be on trial and God should be the judge, but we're now, as humanity, doing the exact opposite here, which is very ironic and it's very sobering, because this is going to help us as the trials continue when we get to Mark 15, Jesus before Pilate. So we want to look at that. Before we do, there is an interesting moment here. I think just this is in here to Mark wanted to give you the picture of, it wasn't that they just left. It was just sheer panic and fear, because in 51, you had a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. And this gets back to this moment when you follow Jesus when it profits you, but when it costs you, or when your narrative that you realize that you created on what you wanted Jesus to be like, which is something we all do as humans, when that turns out to not be exactly true, and it's going to cost you to follow Jesus, that's where the rubber meets the road in this, because you see this, when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind, which you could probably never show that in a movie unless you blurred things out. But that's what happened. It wasn't that they just left him. They left him in a panic. Why would he bring this up?
This is after Mark chapter 10 was the last time it's mentioned here, but he had been doing it repeatedly all the way back to Mark 16. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, and with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside. He said, y'all come up here. He told them what was going to happen. We're going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be betrayed. That's being all over here, and he talks about that 2 or 3 chapters later, Mark does. Be betrayed to the chief, the priests, the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. He'll hand him over to the Gentiles, the Romans, who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. Jase, that fell on deaf ears.
Fell on deaf ears. And so then it leads us to 53, which is what we're going to talk about. We're probably not going to get through all this in this podcast because this is pretty deep, but it's very sobering. So they took Jesus to the high priest and all the chief priests, and so now he's experiencing this abandonment.
Which he had already predicted.
He's experiencing this abandonment from all his followers, which is eventually going to lead the abandonment of God himself, the Father, when he's on the cross. And so all the elders and the teachers of the law came together. Now, Peter followed him at a distance. We talked about that earlier. Right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire, which I thought about that. Just, a lot of times when you're staring at a fire, you tend to just think about things and reflect,
Reflect.
How many times have you been at a campfire? Well, boy, I wonder what he was reflecting on right here. So the chief priests in 55 and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they didn't find any. Because you got to remember that this whole thing with Judas and all the disciples abandoning him, but you got to remember the big picture. Jesus hasn't done anything wrong. Nothing.
Nothing.
So for this to work, you're going to, it's hard to get in any society, to get a person convicted of a crime they didn't commit, but
many testified falsely against him.
Well, right. But it's very difficult to get a person convicted and get the death penalty when not only did they not commit the crime that you're accusing them of, that they haven't committed any crime ever in their entire life. So how this happens is this: the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus, which is what you would normally do in a trial. But we all know that there was none, so that they could put him to death, but they didn't find any. Many testified falsely against him, because it had to be falsely. But watch what happened. But their statements didn't agree, which is common sense because he didn't do anything. So then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. Now, this is so it's just fascinating. We heard him say, "I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by men." So we all know that comes from, if you're just now joining our podcast, where is that? In John 2, I think, where it says, well, now I got to go find it, where he says, "Destroy this temple and I'll
raise it up
in 3 days."
It's in verse 19, John 2:19.
John 2:19. Let me just read that. So we're going way back now when he said this, because in John's version, this is right off the bat. Verse 18 of John 2, "Then the Jews demanded of him, 'What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority?'" Because they were always threatened by Jesus as he came across as one who had authority. And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple." And the reason I'm bringing this up, because he just discussed this in Mark 13, 2 chapters before. "And you're now going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said, that they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. So from their perspective, they're saying, well, he's a terrorist.
Because you notice, though, Jase, let's take a break. You notice, though, Jase, Jesus didn't say man-made temple. They said man-made temple. They're the ones that surmise. Yeah.
Well, Jesus was talking about his body and the resurrection.
Correct.
Which his disciples have no excuse for abandoning him, because he's already told them this. This has got to happen.
Over and over.
Over and over, it got to happen. They didn't get it. Narrative not computing.
But if somebody comes along and tells you, Jace, I'm going to do this, that, and the other, 3 days I'm going to die, but I'll be raised, and then we'll talk this over. I mean, you would find it pretty tough to swallow.
Yeah. But now, if you bring this to our life, so this would be the equivalent of you taking a couple buildings in Washington, D.C., and then going around saying that they're going to be destroyed. Because if you said that, well, they get people's attention. They say, wait a minute now.
Yeah.
They're going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
Well, what do you know about that?
Yeah.
And then somebody's saying, well, I heard this guy say that it was going to be destroyed and in 3 days. So, well, whatever that was. So they're basically accusing him of being a temple terrorist.
Yeah.
I mean, you think that's an accurate assessment now?
Oh, I think you're seeing it play out now. I mean, look at this January 6th thing. Some people were there. They were protesting. They were outside the Congress. But what's been attributed to all these people, and some of them did things that were wrong. I'm not saying that crimes weren't committed. But what do you see now? It's everybody that was there wanted to destroy the Capitol. I mean, it's the exact same thing of what you're talking about.
So they took that vein. That was their way to try to get him killed. But look, notice what it says in 58. But not even, 59. Yet even then their testimony didn't agree. So they had other people that were not corroborating this destroy the man-made temple and in 3 days build another.
They've dreamed up a lot of lies here.
Yep. So 60 says, then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer?" Because Jesus is just sitting here. "What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Now, when he asked that, look what he says, which is a famous thing that Jesus has said many times. "I am." It wasn't just, that was not just in response to that question, because you can go look up all the I ams where Jesus said, and do a whole 7-week series on that. And It's awesome. So, because Jesus' nickname is I am, which is the greatest nickname ever. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.
Now, this is like they're looking up right now. It's looking at each other saying, what in the world is this you talking about?
So when Jesus says this, all of a sudden they know what that phrase is, the Son of Man, because that goes back to the Daniel 7, this kind of lingo. All of a sudden, you're claiming to be Messiah. Okay.
I mean, the big dogs are just ripping their clothes off.
Tie this in with the destroying the temple, and you're coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, you pretty much agreed to the accusation.
The charges.
Yeah, because then what's the next statement? The high priest tore his clothes. Well, why do we need any more witnesses? I mean, he just admitted it. He's claiming to be the Messiah, and he's coming on the clouds. I mean, he's not bringing gifts. He's bringing terror. So you have heard this blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. Because think about what they're doing here. It's not just they're persecuting because they don't like him. They're saying, oh, you're claiming to be the Son of Man, the one, Daniel was referring to, and you're going to come in judgment. And so that now that he's elevated himself as something more than just a man, they're now blindfolding him, making fun of him, because they're like, prophesy who hits it. If you're a supernatural being, get yourself out of this.
The guards, they were hitting him with their fists, and the guards took him and beat him.
Yep. So that's basically the first trial.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's again, it's the same mindset that comes forward. Think about how ridiculous this whole situation is, but it really is the mindset of misunderstanding, because we've talked a lot about the disciples missing who Jesus was. These guys have missed it even more, because they're so convinced he's not, unless he all of a sudden starts fighting back and destroying them and calling down lightning out of heaven. They're like, you're not who you say you are. If you were the Messiah, we couldn't be doing this to you. That's what they're saying. That was what their actions were saying.
Yeah. But here's what's the irony of this. And like I said, you have something going on here from a humanity standpoint that's really disturbing. Because Jesus is this claim, him saying I am, which is a claim he made many times that made people uncomfortable. And this claiming to be the Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven, that claim, when you think about what that is, that's saying that God has become a man.
Yeah.
And what are the consequences of that? I mean, you start factoring in all the teachings that we teach that are a result of this claim, in that there's a way for humans to approach God, because it's going to be through him. He came to make that separation between God and man. He came as that bridge. He came to give access, which you're saying, what are the implications of that? The things that are not possible for a human being could be possible if he really is the Son of Man bringing an eternal kingdom. And so this claim that Jesus made was the most explosive in that moment, just from every kind of word you can think of, from an intellectual viewpoint to a personal level, because he's fixed to give his life for the very people that are trying to kill him. And that's why I said, when you kind of look at this backwards, humans are putting God on trial, which when Al and I were discussing this on how to view this, I brought up, to my knowledge, I think the only other place where this happens is in Exodus 17, which there's always an example of something like this. from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And you'll say, well, what do you mean where God is on trial? And you remember the story, Al?
Yeah, before you read that, let's take our last break. Yeah, the setup of the story is they're out in the desert and, they need water to be able to drink, to be able to survive. And so this is the setup for what happens. And then they're like, there is no God. He can't be here. He's not providing for us. So they're basically putting him on trial.
Yeah, so in Exodus 17, they were quarreling with Moses. They're like, give us water to drink. I mean, we're out here. And so Moses said, well, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? So they're testing the Lord, putting him on trial, basically. He doesn't know what he's doing. We're suffering. So the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled. This verse 3 of Exodus 17. They said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? So then Moses cries out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. Now this is really interesting. The Lord answered Moses, walk on ahead of the people, take with you some of the elders, and take in your hand the rod or staff, which was the sign of what they did with the judges. They had the rod, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock. So, I mean, God says, I'm going to stand by the rock. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders, and he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? So think about what he did. You got really two possibilities. The people are not trusting in the Lord. They're griping, they're complaining, they're grumbling. And so God can either strike the people because they're obviously wrong and they're the ones who are sinning, or God says, I'll be on the rock and you strike the rock. And you say, what is the significance of this? Well, Paul got it when he gets to 1 Corinthians 10. You remember when he goes through the warnings from Israel's history, and he said, when the rock was struck, that rock was Christ. And so you see this shadow of what's happening here in this trial, in that, yes, should all these people be struck down for doing this to Jesus? Yes. But God, here he is, just like he did in this Exodus 17, he's going to be struck down so that the people can be saved. I mean, it's the exact mirror image.
No, I love that, Jase. And when you were saying that, it's the only time I thought of another one, because when you said that about the test, it made me think about it. You remember when Jesus was being tempted by Satan? And you remember the second one, he took him up on the highest point of the temple, and he said, if you throw yourself down, nothing will happen to you. And then he quoted a verse, how that, he was to be guarded by God. And you remember what Jesus' answer was? Because now, in essence, Satan was doing the same thing the people were doing back in Exodus 17, that he was putting God on trial. Yeah, this is now, right. I'm saying, you show me. And then what did Jesus say? Do not put your Lord God to the test. So he told him the same thing. You have no right to put God on trial because of who you are as Satan. So I never thought about it, Jase, but that's actually a second example of the exact same thing about putting God on trial.
Well, and in this case, Jesus is going to be smitten, for us, just like God was and the rock, to give them water when they didn't deserve it because of their attitudes and their lack of, putting their lives in God's hand. That 1 Corinthians 10 reference is 2 through 5 when it says they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea, and they ate the spiritual food and drank the spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they bore the judgment of not giving their lives to God.
So another thing I was noticing, Jase, was that, there's not a lot of difference in what you're seeing here with the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. They believe in the idea of Jesus. In other words, they've known that the prophecies were there, the scripture was there, so they believe in the idea of the Messiah. The problem was when he actually got there and they couldn't explain it. They couldn't, they kept saying, well, we can't deny he's doing these miracles. They didn't believe in Jesus. And isn't that exactly what you see in agnosticism today? People believe in the idea of what they would call a great designer, or something had to like get this in motion, because it just doesn't make any, to Dad's point, the saltwater idea just doesn't seem to fit. But then they don't actually believe Jesus and what he says. And so they look at, they see churches or religion. They say, well, I can't really go with that. So instead they just find themselves in this place of having a belief system that they can't actually enact into an everyday existence. I mean, that's exactly the same idea.
Jesus earlier, he had pointed them to start with the notion that he's going to save the Gentiles too. They didn't like that, Al. They didn't like the idea of the Gentiles receiving the evidence of God and the love and mercy of God. They thought, well, do what? They just couldn't see them. They were thinking about the Jewish kingdom. So that's another reason they said, no way. He's even going to, you going to die for those too? Yeah, I'm going to die for them. That's a tough load for them to swallow.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the big picture, and going in with what you're saying, is that when you think about what sin is, it's when you substitute yourself as God.
Yep.
I mean, you want to do what you want to do. You don't care, what even your conscience is telling you to do. What are the cravings of man, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, and
what kind of kingdom are you talking about here?
But here you see that God's grace is him substituting himself for what you deserve.
Yeah, here's the kingdom, and the kingdom's fixing to die. 3 days he'll be raised again. They're like, do what? It was beyond their comprehension. They just couldn't grasp it.
That's what I'm saying. When you take the place of God, you're sinful. When he took the place of you, he died an innocent life and gave himself. And that's really what's going on here. That's why I said it's ironic when you think about humans putting God on trial. When God puts us on trial, he gives us his son and to take our place, which is the scheme of redemption. That's why I think this is really important. When you see Jesus having to answer these accusations, because it's like, well, what do you say? There's another gospel rendition of this, and let's see, where's the parallel passages to this one now? Is it Luke 22? Maybe it's in Luke. But it's almost more like, oh, by the way, he said, when they're trying to come up with this false evidence against him, and when he says, you'll see the Son of Man. Yeah, so when you look at the Luke 22 version of it, watch what he says. They said, if you're the Christ, in 67, if you're the Christ, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, well, if I tell you, you would not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God, which is a little different than Mark's. I mean, he was basically saying, what's it matter? You're not gonna answer me. They all asked, are you then the Son of God? He replied, I am. You are right in saying, I am. Then they said, well, why do we need any more testimony? We've heard it from his own lips. So they basically tried to trap him into saying, I'm the Son of God. And he actually said, it's not going to matter because you've already made up your mind. And so there was nothing he could do. I mean, there was literally nothing he could do. They were so enraged, and his declaration of who he is, and he actually is, led him to dying. I just think it's fascinating.
It's really good. We'll discuss a little more. We're out of time in our overtime segment. blazetv.com/unashamed is where you go to get that. We'll flesh that out a little bit more. And to Dad's point, for the next podcast, we're going to get to where he is before the Gentile powers that be, and that's Pilate. So we'll get into that next time on Unashamed. Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.